So in the last video I started a new thing where I just don't do any background music and just stick straight to the voiceovers. I truly hope that does not get too monotonous because this is a rather long video. You guys may remember this from the last video. Not a lot has changed. All I've really done is just a little bit of cleanup work on the clear coat and give it a good polish. Moving on with the chassis though, these uprights, from what I remember when I built the FXX, that seam is visible. So I'm going to try to hide that the best I can. Now off camera, I painted the control arms black and then I masked them off. Later on, this is all going to get a nice coat of aluminum paint. And for some reason, I just thought it would be easier to mask everything before it's all assembled. Now as you saw there, I was jumping around test fitting this on both sides because honestly, I do not remember which side is which. Luckily though, they will only go on one way. So I'm going to do just a little drop to me extra thin to essentially tack weld this in place for the next step, which is filling up that ugly noticeable seam. Now you guys know me, I don't like to use putty, so I just use super glue. Now once I know the gap is going to be filled, I'm just going to go in and sand it all back and smooth it out. And I like to chew my nails. I don't like doing it, it's just a habit. I hate it, I wish I'd stop. But it's kind of hard to find a fingernail to do the fingernail test. But so far, every seam has passed. It's super smooth, it does not catch my fingernail. We're good to go for paint. Now since I was kind of rough when I was handling this, I'm just going to double check on my masking, make sure it's still good. Now it must have been fairly decent because I moved straight on to paint. Now for the paint here, I'm using that Vallejo metallizer. If I remember right, it was either flat aluminum or dark aluminum. Might be dull aluminum now that I think about it. Yeah, it was dull aluminum that I sprayed all this in. Now other than the sub-assembly for the chassis, I also painted all the shock assemblies. Now the shock assemblies, they're a collaboration of 5 or 6 different colors. I don't quite remember, but I'm going to use this as a base and then build my layers up on top of it. Now that's supposed to add depth and give a sense of realism, and you'll guys see later. You could be the judge. Now while the seams did cover up very well, there's a low spot right there on that frame rail, which is fine. I've done some test fitting. The exhaust will cover that. So I'm just finishing up some hand painting now. This time I'm definitely 100% sure I'm using the dark aluminum for the shock body. I'm a bit upset here because even though these are different colors, here on film or the video, whatever you call these things these days, they all look kind of the same. In real life, to the naked eye, they look so much better. Now with the majority of the painting done, I'm just going to start at the front of the chassis and work my way back. Now just a forewarning here guys, there's going to be no order of operations. I do not follow the instructions that well. It just whatever paint is dry on a part, that's what I start working on next. Now, while the front of the chassis is fairly detailed and there's some extra parts, you'll notice that I didn't really spend a lot of time detailing this. That's because once it's all assembled, it's covered. You can't see it. I did, however, uh, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yeah, hey, I remember what I was going to say. Earlier, I had dropped my phone. Now the mic is picking up this weird echo thing. I don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry. Now, if you guys are the ones who follow instructions, you'll notice that you're supposed to put the steering linkage in before you add the A-arms. Now, you could still get everything together, as you see, it's just a little bit more involved. Now, all those layers of paints I had built up on these shock assemblies, it made things a little bit tight. Now, while glue does easily hold it all together, I like things to fit. I don't want everything to be in a bind and only held together with glue. Now, I have a little tip for you. Those of you who follow the instructions, just skip on ahead because this doesn't apply to you. The instructions say to install the axles, then drop the entire assembly into the cradle, then add those uprights. Now, if you follow my assembly, you could add the uprights at any time you want, and then just install the axles later. Now, I am kind of struggling getting them down in there because I got really big hands, and I dropped my tweezers, and I'm too lazy to pick them up. Now, because I did assemble everything the way I did, it's not a big deal. You got to just kind of bend the upper control arm ever so slightly, and then bend the bottom control arm ever so slightly, and just sandwich the hub in there. Now, if you don't bend them too much, they'll just kind of spring back into place and lock that hub in. Now, clearly this would have been easier without the axle in the center there, because there are 3 points of alignment here. We have to nail every one of them. If you guys are like me and use a crazy modeler detail set, be careful, because it's sharp and pokey. Now, since I only get about an hour a night to work on my models, I spent the entire night contouring this around the shape and curvature of this firewall. Now, it was not that difficult per se, it was just extremely time consuming. But eventually, I get it bent up and contoured just right, so I'm going to move on to installing the glass. Now, being that I've had this kit for a number of years, it's been open and partially assembled, I thought I'd lost those two pieces. But somewhere along the lines, I just installed them while everything was still on the sprue. That is not like me because I like to have everything off to get good, even paint coverage. So sadly, you didn't get to see that whole assembly, but as you can see by the instructions, it's very simple. Now, if you guys don't have any of this Tester's metallic silver, go get some. As you can see here, I got 2 bottles of it. Now, if you guys like to build a lot of Tamiya kits, Fujimi kits, and some Aoshima kits, you'll notice that they have 2 separate sets of chrome trees. One is a super shiny high gloss chrome, and you got one like this, which is kind of a matte dull chrome. The Tester's metallic silver is a perfect 100% match for the dull chrome. Now this piece, it doesn't fit that well. Little tiny square tabs leaves a whole lot of wiggle room, so it's kind of wobbly. But before the glue sets, just make sure your exhaust tips are pointing out straight. Now for the time being, these 2 slots here, they do not get any glue or adhesive. The engine cradle is supposed to kind of just float there for now. In the meantime though, there are just a few points of alignment, the exhaust here, and those uprights that we had cleaned up and made pretty earlier. Now with the engine in place, we could finally start adding some of the little knick-knack things. Now the instructions say for the door hinges to be black, but I wanted to kind of break up the monotony of all the different shades of black and carbon fiber, so I painted them silver. Now I'm not really a big fan of using my X-Acto to kind of scrape away layers little by little to create an opening. I found that drilling the perimeter and then just knocking it out is so much quicker. As you can see, that was necessary to make room for the photo etch mesh here. So off camera, I'm just going to use some needle files to go in there and clean all that up. Now since I did gut this, I kind of feared that it lost some structural integrity, so I'm going to do a quick little test fit just to make sure it still fits. And again, off camera, I just glued the little mesh in, spray painted it black, and now I'm going to install it again, this time with glue. Ooh, if you guys heard that buzzing, I just got a new subscriber. I can't pronounce that name. But whomever it was that just subscribed at 1:31 a.m. Central Time on Sunday, March 13th, thank you. Alright, back to the video. You guys may remember this from the last video. It's finally time to install it and make it permanent. Now the detail kit does come with some photo etch fans and a grill and all that good stuff. Due to the front bonnet being glued in place and not openable, I am not going to waste my time building it because you really can't see it. And that is fine though, we'll just throw it back in the parts bin and it'll get used for a later build. I've already got it in mind. Back to the video though, we are assembling what are essentially the upper and lower radiator hoses. Being a Tamiya kit, everything has very large and perfectly aligned pinholes for everything to fit in just right. Same goes for this piece right here, it just falls into place. Or at least it did during all the test fitting. Now that I have the camera on, I struggle a bit. Now the instructions do say to paint silver to mimic some heat shielding on the top of this piece. It is not visible, so I'm not going to waste my time or my paint. Remember earlier I was talking about how the engine cradle kind of just floats in place? This is a piece that locks it in place. These are the remote reservoirs for the rear shocks. They are connected by a little hose, so I'm going to drill this out so that I could add those hoses. Now it is kind of fiddly once everything gets in place. It's real tight, so I drilled this all the way through to give myself some wiggle room to make sure all the hoses are the same length. And off camera, I drilled the corresponding holes for the top of the shocks as well. Now looking at the reference photos, these reservoirs, they're like a dingy gold or a heat stained titanium. I'm not really sure. But to mimic that, I just basically did a very bad paint job on these. Now try as I might, I cannot install them on camera here, being that I work to a viewfinder and I have zero depth perception. But once they are installed, we're going to move on with the rest of the rear suspension. It kind of goes in layers. We got to do the sway bar first. And finally, the rear shock assembly will just drop into place. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, everything in there is real kind of fiddly and tight, so just off camera, I installed them hoses. It was actually pretty easy. It was essentially just sliding some wire into a hole, just difficult to do on camera. Anywho, next couple of scenes are going to be just installing random parts. Now since I am using photo etch for the heat shield, that sharp 90-degree corner there on that edge, kind of had to break it and round it over a little bit just to make everything fit. I think I forgot to put glue on this before I turned the camera on. This piece, I think, is the heater core, so we're going to add some heater hose to it. So to do that, I'm just going to cut the little nubbins off and then drill them out. To make sure I'm just snipping the right thing, I'm going to peek over the camera here just to make sure I got everything aligned. Once I'm happy, I give it the old snip snip. And off camera, I drilled our holes, I painted the little surrounder back, then stripped some of the sheathing off the wire. Now, if I remember right, this was 14 gauge wire. Don't quote me on that though, because I would have to get dressed and run out to the garage and look, but it's cold, so I'm not gonna do that. It might be 16 gauge. I don't really remember. Now this piece does just fit in here, but since I added the wires, it's kind of top heavy, so it just wants to tip over, so you just gotta hold it in place till your glue dries. Now, as good as Tamiya is with giving us some little alignment pins, these were not that precise. Either that or I laid the clear on too thick and it kind of drowned it out. Nope, I'm perfect. This is Tamiya's fault. So these heat exchangers, they're kind of boring. So I'm going to use this assortment of rod and plastic tubing, and I'm going to make us some plumbing lines. And I do apologize that I did not record any of it because I had to use my phone to look at reference photos. It was a good 2 or 3 days looking at photos, test fitting, making little bends, test fitting, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually I got something that I'm happy enough to pass off. Now it's not perfect as I did it all by hand, but well, it's pretty damn close. Now, if you guys remember when I did the F40, it had a lot of braided cable for the heat exchangers. I have some of that left over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue them in place on the fender side. It will make installing and routing everything so much easier later. But to make it all work and look good, I also had to add this little inlet thing here on the intake assembly. Now I do know where the top hose goes, but the bottom hose, it looks like it just routes under the intake and through the little plenum stacks there. Luckily, we won't see it end because it will all be hidden underneath the intake plenum here. And I also studied the parts diagrams from the Ferrari website, also to help me bend everything and get the right shape and contours. So I'm fairly certain this is the oil cooler. Now this is partly why this video took so long to get out. Just a lot of test fitting, making sure everything was right. Like them heater hoses. Just fits down there perfectly. Now the driver's side, I also had to fabricate some plumbing and run some hoses, but they do not make braided cable that small for what I was needing. So I just used some 20 gauge wire and just kind of made it look the part. I really need to work out a new camera rig because working to a viewfinder here, it's makes some things rather difficult. Now, I don't want to brag or anything, but I completely forgot about these little structural pieces here when I was fabricating them hoses, but everything cleared perfectly. And with that piece installed, the chassis, it is now done. Or at least as far as I'm going to do for this video. Now, with that being said, here are some still shots. I remembered to take some photos this time. Now, I do realize this video ended up being about 30 minutes long. I'm sorry, there's just a whole lot to cover here. So if you did make it this far, thank you so much for watching. It truly means a lot to me.